Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, Walking the Spiritual Walk. My name is Steve Van Eiderstein. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you for your patience as I have been on hiatus for the past couple of weeks. I have had a lot of life showing up lately, and I appreciate you bearing with me and sticking with me as we took the time, as I took the time I needed to kind of get things back in order. That's part of this whole living spiritually thing is understanding when you need to prioritize and kind of take some time for yourself, which is something I had to do. And now I'm back and I'm excited to be here to read the next chapter. We are going to be reading the next chapter out of the book I Was a Pagan by VC Kitchen. And we just read about his first engagement with the Oxford group. And we're going to be reading the chapter, I think, about being reborn, actually. This is the copy I read out of. It is called, I'm trying to see, get that in the light a little bit more. There we go. It's I Was a Pagan by VC Kitchen. You can also get the reprinted copy that's secondarily named or titled Believing in False Gods. I Was a Pagan by VC Kitchen. It's a facsimile reprint, exactly the same as this copy. So let's go ahead and get into it and see where we go. So this is the 7th chapter, titled The Business of Being Reborn in Life. Transformation. It's already starting off good. It seems amazing that anyone whose life had grown as futile as mine should want to hang on to his fruitless pursuits and tasteless diversions. Doing what I wanted had never brought me any real fun, yet I thought that I would be a fool to give up these things. Despite what I had seen at Briarcliff, therefore, I decided that I, the great VC Kitchen, was a little different from other people and could continue to live outside the law of self-denial. I also had begun to suspect that with all my acting and pretense, I was fooling comparatively few people. And whether I was fooling them or not, I knew quite well that I was finding no real fellowship with them. As for my home, what my wife did not know would not hurt her, and it might prove very uncomfortable for me should she get wind of it. In my own family, as elsewhere, therefore, I, the self-sufficient VC Kitchen, would continue to live outside the law of fellowship. At Briarcliff, they had said that I must surrender my will, obeying God in all things. Even if he had told me to go to the ends of the world, throw up my job, or give up my friends. Clearly, I could not surrender my will to God if I intended to go on doing what I wanted to do, or pretending to be the sort of man I wanted people to think I was. So I, the self-determining VC Kitchen, would continue to live outside the law of obedience. All these laws he's mentioning are in italics, by the way. I was fighting at that time, although I did not know it, to retain not only my comforts and the strong material affinities I had formed in life, but to keep some vestige of my self-approval and hold on to the remnants of my pride. This battle, however, only lasted a few days. I had at last met people who had more than arguments to fight with. They had experience to offer, and an experience that I myself could taste. And it proved to be a pleasure experience, which I very soon discovered made me want to live that kind of life. A powerless philosophy, dry and dusty ethics, a pleasureless psychology, and the lower reaches of a still intellectualized metaphysics had failed to pry me loose from the affinities I found in my lawless pagan world. They offered no higher affection, which could lure me out of my old life. But when, through contact with the Oxford group, I actually began to find satisfaction in self-denial, when I actually found fellowship instead of shame in honest sharing, and when, Through obedience to a higher law, I gained my first knowledge of true freedom. There began that change of feeling which culminated in the change of my entire life. This change commenced a few days after my after my return from the group house party. My business took me to New Haven, and while on the train, I had ample time for reflection. It was then that I made my first experiments in self-denial. The trip, for instance, was one that I had always drowned in tobacco smoke, for I was an inveterate smoker and lit my pipe the first thing in the morning, putting it out the last thing at night. When, at times, I felt it threatening my heart and lungs, I had made the effort to cut down smoking. But that never lasted more than a few days, and I had never succeeded in cutting it out. This time, however, I decided to see if the God the Oxford group had talked about that could and would assist me. I asked his help rather than attempt the thing myself, and something unusual happened. I did not strike a match all day, and, to my surprise, felt no accompanying nervousness or discomfort. It was the first time I had ever won a battle of this kind with what seemed to me an utter lack of struggle. I felt a strange sense of dependence on some power that was utterly dependable. A power within, yet coming from outside myself. A power far stronger than I was. And even as I tried to argue, if this power were only my better self, what a great relief it would always be to have that better self to depend on. There would be, in such a case, I thought, no more inner conflict in my life, no more uncertainty of mind, no more question of should I do this or should I do that. There would be but one answer for me, the clear, unhesitating answer that this other power would always give me. Release from tobacco was not the only freedom that I gained that day. I found at the same time a strange release from boredom. The trip had promised to be one of tedious routine. I had intended to hasten through the details of getting my copy approved and to catch the first train home with as little discussion as possible. I found, however, that I was reviewing my own copy with new interest, and I listened to the criticisms of my client, not with any thought of brushing them aside and being on my way, but with the thought of using them to write a more effective advertisement. So absorbed did I become in turning out a better piece of work that I not only failed to get away early, but remained with my client after hours. I not only missed the train I had hoped to catch, but missed several trains thereafter. It was, in fact, past 6 o'clock, and I had nearly 2 hours to wait when I reached the railway station. Supper took scarcely half an hour, and I was wondering what to do with the rest of my time when the train announcer beckoned to me. "There's a New York train just ready to leave," he said. "It's the train you missed. It broke down in West Haven and has just backed up into this station." I smiled, for this seemed most obliging of the train. It seemed, in fact, almost as if, in recompense for giving extra time myself, God had spared me the annoyance of boarding that train, had given me opportunity to enjoy a comfortable supper, and then saw to it that I had no further time to wait before resuming my journey. This, to say the least, had been a day of unusual occurrences, and I decided that there might, after all, be some fun in living with my usual comforts and interests less at heart. I did not realize it then, but I had already begun to live within the laws of self-denial. Even before this trip, moreover, I had begun experiments in a new kind of fellowship. While driving back from Briarcliff, for instance, I had noted a new interest and animation in my relationship with the man I had known most intimately for the last 20 years. He did not reach my house till 3 in the morning, yet so interested were we that we routed my astonished wife out of bed and sat up till 5 in order just to tell her just what we thought about it. And there, as we talked, strange things began to come to mind. I actually imagined myself sitting beside her and telling her the things I was sure I never could or would tell her. The outcome of these curious experiences was that several days later, we both went back to Briarcliff. The Oxford Group house party was still in full swing, yet this time we stayed but a day and a night, yet that was enough to water the seed already planted. We were not, as we thought, fully convinced yet. We were not, as we thought, fully convinced yet. Oddly enough, as we drove home the second time, each was ready to defend the movement valiantly when anyone started to criticize what he had seen and heard. Inwardly, I knew it was a step I would have to take someday. I hoped my wife would take it too. But neither of us guessed just then how close we really were to the brink of that new world. The miracle, in fact, began to happen as soon as we reached home. I found myself sitting on the sofa by my wife, just as I had imagined. She started the conversation, and then, without knowing exactly how or why, I found myself blurting out the whole story I was never going to tell anybody. My wife, to my amazement, had something to tell too. We both were taken by surprise and then by a sense of great relief, which, to me, proved even more surprising. I could and would have sworn that the sins of my past life were not really bothering me. Though I was ashamed to let the rest of the world know my secret acts and desires, they were not, I thought, troubling my own conscience. And my wife, when I heard her story, seemed to have even less cause for uneasiness. When, however, we told each other fully and freely the kind of people that we really were, the kind of things we really did and thought, when we took off the masks we had worn through 17 years of married life and stopped pretending to each other to be something that we were not, we each distinctly felt an acute and actual sense of physical release. And though some 40,000 pounds had rolled from our shoulders. This sensation of release and freedom is, I now know, an almost universal experience for all who face and confess their sins under the eyes of God and one other person. This is especially true if that other person is one who has suffered through your sins, as, in my case, my own wife had suffered. Being honest with her was the first time I had ever been really and fully honest with anybody. An entirely new bond sprang up between us, and although again I did not realize it, I had begun to live in a touch with God, and without barriers of bluff between myself and my fellow human beings. I had, in fact, begun to live within the laws of fellowship. Forming a clean contact with God, however, does no good unless God then chooses to release his power. And God, as I have said before, will not do so unless he knows that he can trust you with that power. He will not give you power to use just as you wish, but only as he wills, and only for as long as you surrender your own will in absolute obedience. If you admit you need his advice and then decline to take or follow God's guidance as it is given, you might just as well continue to blunder along on your own from the very beginning. By God's grace, however, my wife and I no sooner had taken the very necessary step of sharing and confessing our sins to each other than we had led to take the second and crucial step of self-surrender. I feel, she said, that we should have a little prayer together. Something we had not done or even thought of doing since 17 years ago. We had knelt before the altar. Now, however, we prayed out loud, and we meant it. I do not remember the actual words of my first genuine prayer. In general, however, it ran very much like this. I surrender to thee my entire life, O God. I have made it a mess of it, trying to run it myself. You take it, the whole thing, and run it for me, according to your will and plan. According to earliest recollections, I began my pagan life by wanting to be captain of a tugboat. I ended it by resigning the captaincy of everything I was, knew, or possessed. I am the master of my fate gave way to thine is the kingdom and the power. Thy will be done was substituted for I am the captain of my soul. As we thus tossed aside Invictus and took up the Lord's Prayer, we stood together out of our own light and began, as a united team, a joyous and adventurous exploration of the third or spiritual realm. We were reborn into life and began for the first time to live under the laws of obedience. As we emerged into this new environment, we felt ourselves responsive to new stimuli. We gained, as it were, new senses like a man who, paralyzed through life, had awakened to his first definite sense of sunshine, and heart, and heat, and cold, and taste, and touch, and smell, and hearing. Like such a man, we found ourselves in a wholly new relationship with the world in which we were living. It was, in fact, a wholly new world, a world in which Jesus Christ, who had been a man, a world in which Jesus Christ, who had been to me a dead historical character, became a vital, living presence, who could actually be felt. With the inspiration of this presence, it was a world in which the moral and spiritual qualities of human beings, or their lack, were as clearly discernible as their mental and physical qualities, and had been in the world of our former understanding. Now, said my wife, I know what is meant by the peace that passeth all understanding. And it passed understanding indeed. Never had I known, guessed, or imagined anything like this within the range of human experience. I was in a world of which I had possessed no former ken. Nonsense, said some of my friends. It was just new to you. We, for our part, have known religious experience all our lives, and it's an old story. I know, however, what most of them meant. They meant that self-appreciative kind of pink glow I had experienced when baptized. They meant the occasional cold chills that sometimes chased along your spine when you hear a beautifully played organ. They meant the being in tune with nature, the reverence and the awe you may feel sitting on a sand dune and looking out at the ocean, or sitting alone on the top of a high mountain. I too had felt those things, but I can assure my readers, and so can thousands of others in the Oxford group and elsewhere, that they are nothing at all, compared to the deep, vital, life-changing experience of facing your sins honestly and of then surrendering your life to God, wholly and without reserve. I had not lived at all until I began with new quality of life, a life which is lived within the laws of self-sacrifice, fellowship, and obedience. It is then, and then only, that a self hitherto divided and consciously wrong, inferior, and unhappy becomes unsatisfied and unconsciously right, superior, and happy, according to the famous definition of William James. It is then and then only that the luminous vision, abundant life, integration of character, power of helpfulness, and creativeness is living and creativeness in living come to those who confess not merely their faith but their sins, and who profess not merely a belief in God but begin to practice absolute obedience to him. What a difference all this made in the actual business of living. Instead of finding myself sure-fitted with the stale delights and ever-deadening throwback of self-indulgence, I found myself open to and refreshed by the kind of joy to be found in God's approval. It is joy which is ever so much keener and more zestful than any I had ever experienced from self or public approval. Instead of the pretenses of society, a cloying intimacy with women, a shallow friendship with men, utter boredom with most people, and a self-seeking eye to all, I found that deep and joyful fellowship of the communion of saints. Instead of the sourness of my own sweet way, instead of the self-promoting plans and their inevitable frustration, the disappointment, instead of rigid programs leading nowhere and vainglorious ideals, I found the energy pattern, quote unquote, of God as free and rhythmic as a bird and as different from the slow and stupid mapped out plans of men. It was thus that I found the higher affection which my false gods, philosophies, ethics, and psychology could not supply. I came upon it not by hearsay, but through actual personal experience. I learned to want to live this higher quality of life through actually tasting the only love in the world that surpasses man's love of self and gives to him the power of regeneration. Wow. Wow. There's so much to unpack in that chapter. Let me tell you, there's so much. I'm very excited to go through that chapter and to review it for you on the next episode. That was incredible. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did, and I'm glad to be back on with you guys sharing this experience. So I will be back on hopefully next weekend with the review of this chapter, and it might be a long one. There's just so much to actually go through, but I appreciate y'all's time, and until next time, thanks.